Okay, I guess we can get started. So welcome, everyone. I'm Margaret Keith, and I'm a member of Windsor Essex on Watch, aka WOW. And tonight we're going to hear from several important voices about the seemingly relentless problem of poor air quality that we're all facing, and its links to ill health, pollution, and climate change. And hopefully we'll be left with some ideas about what we can do about this complex problem. And as we start this conversation, we're all very mindful of the horrors of war and the wanton killings going on in the world right now. And as we're focusing on the toxic effects of air pollution, we recognize that this is just a part of a much larger and much needed movement to reclaim human rights, justice, and equality. This gathering is sponsored by WOW, which was launched over a decade ago on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people of the Three Fires Confederacy, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa. We recognize that all of Canada resides on traditional unceded and/or treaty lands of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and we're grateful for their ongoing care, respect, and love of the land, air, and water that we now share. And we endeavor to actively support reconciliation and decolonization efforts. So we're planning to keep tonight's event to an hour. If we can adhere to our planned schedule, you'll have a chance to ask our speakers questions in writing via the chat, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to write in your questions as they come to you, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Philippa von Ziegenweit will now introduce our first speaker. Philippa?
Thank you, Margaret, and good evening, everybody. Our first speaker this evening is Seth Klein. He's the team lead with the Climate Emergency Unit, which is a 5-year project at the David Suzuki Institute. He's also the author of the book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. Seth is an adjunct professor with Simon Fraser University's Urban Studies program. He grew up in Montreal, holds a BA in International Relations and a B.Ed from the University of Toronto, as well as an MA in Political Science from Simon Fraser University. Welcome, Seth.
Thank you. Well, good evening, friends, and thank you for this invitation to join you. Congratulations to WOW on this event. I'm joining you with gratitude from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, otherwise known as Vancouver. Our time is short, so I'm going to jump right in. The organizers have asked me to provide some overall context for the discussion tonight. I'm not an expert in your local air quality by any measure, but I know a thing or two about the climate crisis, and the common denominator is the burning of fossil fuels. The combusting of fossil fuels, mainly the gas we burn in our vehicles and the so-called natural gas we burn to heat our homes and buildings, along with the extraction and production of those fossil fuels, is the source of 80 to 85% of the carbon pollution that is heating up our planet and causing extreme weather events and climate chaos. And as the good folks at CAPE have done such a good job of pointing out in their leadership of the national campaign to ban fossil fuel advertising, the same combusting of fossil fuels is also the leading source of air pollution that is causing childhood asthma and a major source of premature death. We know that fossil fuel air pollution is responsible for over 8.5 million deaths per year worldwide, or 1 in 7 premature deaths in Canada. Now, this summer, toxic wildfire smoke was another major source of poor and deadly air quality. And we now know from a growing field of attribution science that human-induced climate change is making those fires more frequent and more ferocious. We know from a study published this summer that 37% of the total burned forest area in Western Canada and the United States between the mid-'80s and 2021 can be traced back to just 88 major fossil fuel producers and cement manufacturers. We know, courtesy of the World Weather Attribution Initiative, that the record extreme fires in Quebec this summer, which blanketed you folks in smoke, were twice as likely to happen and burn more intensely due to human caused global heating. Now, the media have done a slightly better job of connecting these extreme weather events like forest fires to climate change, but still a very poor job of connecting the next dot, explaining that the leading cause of climate change is the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. But there's a final contextual offering that I want to make this evening, and it's about the political forces that play blocking progress on this task of our lives, this emergency undertaking to decarbonize and hasten our transition off fossil fuels. Friends, the truth is we have made remarkably little progress on lowering our greenhouse gas emissions, and we urgently need to confront the fossil fuel industry itself for holding us back. I want to screen share a chart with you. This is Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back the last 20 years, with a little hat tip to Greta Thunberg, and her apt description of climate promises to date is so much blah, blah, blah. You know, let this chart sink in. And what you basically see is a flat line. Our GHG emissions plateaued at an historic high. We have failed to bend the curve. But let me show you another slide. Here's the same slide for you folks in Ontario. And you'll notice it looks a little different. It's marked by some solid decreases between 2004 and 2009. Now, what did you do then? You did something truly fantastic. You phased out coal-generated electricity. It was the culmination of a fabulous campaign led by health experts who made the case that we need to do this not only for reasons of climate change, but also to improve air quality and save kids' lives. So congrats on that. But the bad news is that then we've spent the next dozen years accomplishing close to nothing. We're stuck. Now, some of you may have heard me give talks before, and if so, you've probably heard me speak about what I call the 6 markers of emergency mode. This is the framework my team and I employ at the Climate Emergency Unit, and I'm going to call it up now. These are my 6 markers for when you know that a government has actually shifted into an emergency mode. It spends what it takes to win. It creates new institutions to get the job done. Importantly, particularly in a city, it shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as needed. 4th, it commits to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures necessary to combat it. 5th, it commits to leave no one behind, knowing that to really mobilize a society requires social solidarity, and inequality is toxic to social solidarity. And 6th, it centers Indigenous leadership rights and title. Now, folks, I'm almost out of time, and I know that in a few days from now, most of you are going to forget my 6 markers. I know it's sad but true. So I'm going to give you a little trick, okay? If you don't remember the 6 markers, if you want to know if your government has actually got a plan that's in emergency mode, look at the reaction of the fossil fuel companies. If the fossil fuel companies are on the stage saying we can get behind this plan, you ain't got a plan. If, on the other hand, you can see some panic in the whites of their eyes, maybe you're onto something. So you want to improve air quality? Demand a real climate emergency plan that hits all 6 markers from our governments at all levels. Embrace the need to confront the fossil fuel companies, the gas utility, Enbridge in your case, in my case, it's called FortisBC. Those 2 companies are 2 of the 14 gas utilities that are members of the North American Consortium to Combat Electrification. That's not my description of it, that's the actual name. The banks who finance them, the vehicle manufacturers who seek to slow regulatory progress, the fossil fuel advertisements, the highway expanders, and find your political climate champions, those who are not afraid to invite the ire of these fossil fuel companies with you. Thanks.
Thank you, Seth. That's pretty sobering. And I can tell you one of our local climate champions, our Councillor Kieran McKenzie, he's here in the audience. I'm very happy to see him here. I also know that you can't stay with us till the end of this webinar, and we were hoping to squeeze in a couple of questions. So perhaps I can just ask you this quick one before we move on to our next guest. Is there something that gives you hope?
Well, it's always such a loaded question, because the truth is all of us who track this stuff walk a bit of a razor's edge between hope and despair. I find hope in the youth mobilization. I find some hope in the Indigenous-led efforts to block fossil fuel expansion. But look, the great climate scientist, Kate Marvell, she says in this climate emergency, we don't need optimists, we need heroes. Some of you will know I draw a lot of inspiration from the World War II story, where 1 million Canadians enlisted in that fight. And you know what they didn't know? They didn't know if they would win. And I'm happy to hear that you have a city councilors here. Let me give you one final example where I find some hope. And I'm biased in telling you this. The political climate champs are out there. I'm married to one of them. My wife is a Vancouver city councilor. And 5 years ago, she moved the first climate emergency motion in English Canada. But it wasn't just symbolic. Out of that motion, as of 2 years ago in my city, in Vancouver, new buildings can't use fossil fuels for space and water heating. That's years before provincial targets for these things. That's huge, because buildings in most cities are the source of about half of the greenhouse gas emissions. And interestingly, even though she had that win in the context of a city council that was very politically divided all over the political map, interestingly, those motions passed unanimously. Now, how did that happen? It happened because, well, first of all, my wife's very good at her job. But what she would say is each time those votes happened, dozens of high school students skipped school. They rallied outside. They spoke in front of council. They filled the galleries. And they basically made it politically impossible for even some of the more conservative councillors to vote no. They did that. And as a result, this is not a political wedge issue in my city. And I think that can be a model for you too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next guest is Ada Lockridge. Now, Ada is one of the founding members of the Aamjiwnaang Environment Committee. The Aamjiwnaang Reserve, which is near Sarnia, is surrounded by petrochemical facilities. For decades, Ada has been one of her community's most significant environmental justice advocates, exposing the harmful toxic air pollution from Sarnia's Chemical Valley. Welcome, Ada.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Oh, I'm trying to set this up. Sorry. It's okay. Okay, I'm just going to read what I have, okay? So Aamjiwnaang is surrounded by what is called Chemical Valley. We were here first. I never really paid attention to the industries around us. We were never taught anything in school or anything about the chemical plants or its health effects. Our family has gone through 2 evacuations of the whole reserve. There was some incident happening, like one was Dow, one was Suncor. Can't remember all the stuff, but we had to, everybody had to leave anyway. We can smell, hear, taste, see, and feel different happenings around us. But I figured somebody was watching out for us and wouldn't put our health in danger like that. So in 2002, Suncor announced they were going to build their largest ethanol plant adjacent to Aamjiwnaang. A group was formed as an ad hoc committee for the sole reason of getting the plant away from us. We had a petition, a walk of prayers, we blocked roads, and then we ended up meeting up with the OCAL folks, and they taught us about the National Pollution Release Inventory and the known health effects of these carcinogens when exposed. We gave them one of our old health studies, and when it was given to chief and council after the study was done, they were told everything was okay. But we had Michael Gilbertson read it over, and he questioned us about the high levels of mercury that was found in the sediment in the creek, Telford Creek, that flows through the reserve. So we hired another guy to come and retest those sediments to see what the differences were. And we were also asked about a boy-girl ratio here on the reserve. That was easy enough to find out with our membership list. That's when we found out about the 2 girls to 1 boy being born. We also did body mapping, asking the members on the reserve about their health. With this exercise, we found out that the children had a lot of learning disabilities, breathing issues, adult women having a lot of miscarriages, and there's a lot of cancers. Suncor decided to move that plant a few miles down the road. Then some guy ended up bringing 150 barrels of toxic stuff to the reserve. It caused a big commotion. Indian Affairs had to pay 90% of the cleanup charge. People like with the birth ratio, people from all over the world were coming, Toronto, Japan, California, all kinds of TV people, newspaper people. And this, when all this was going on, that's when I figured out this is a lot bigger than I ever thought it could be. So with all this knowledge, we had to make Chief and Council make the Health and Environment a standing committee. We had Gordon Miller here, the Environment Commissioner, to facilitate a meeting with all the government folks that are supposed to look out after us, all in one room. It was kind of funny, but not, with a lot of them pointing fingers at each other saying that's not their responsibility. After that, we met with the folks of Global Community Monitoring from California to teach us about their bucket brigades. That's monitoring and sampling the air ourselves. We would send the bags off to California, and all of this was United States Environment Protection approved. They were not associated with industry or government, and they were tested for like 63 known chemicals and had the lowest detection levels. That's when we found out what we were really breathing. The first sample we took had very high levels of benzene, different kinds of benzene too. Since all that and a whole lot of meetings, we have one stationary air monitor and 3 pointers. Okay, so you can find the results. So it's near real-time results on the CASA site. CASA is Clean Air Sarnia and Area. So you can always check those out. There has been new standards made for benzene and sulfur, which hadn't been updated in years. So with the monitors, the one it's actually named Ada Rogers Lockridge. They named it after me. It's showing high levels of benzene and sulfurs all the time, well, quite often. And the company has been notified by Chief and Council, like talking to them about this. They've contacted the Ministry of Environment, and apparently nobody really cares about this, but like, it's like, why would you have the monitors there if you're not going to do anything about it? I think they just want us to be out in the papers and news more for them to get moving a little bit faster. That's about it. Short version of everything that I've done.
Thank you. I've just posted the link to the site in the chat so people can look at
Oh,
that.
awesome.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you.
Our next guest, moving on, is Jenna Alberfai. Jenna is a climate justice organizer with Climate Strike Canada, Fridays for Future Windsor Essex, and the Windsor Essex Youth Climate Council. She's in her 3rd year as a Bachelor of Environmental Studies student. Jenna is interested in urban design and planning, as well as city building and making more connected, just, and green communities. Welcome, Jenna.
Hello, everybody. It's really nice being here today. I don't have any specific qualifications to be talking to you here today, but I will tell you that my life and your life are probably very similar. And like, look over the summer, how many times did you want to go and like ride your bike because it's going to be cold here in the winter and you couldn't because it was really, really hot, or it was raining like too much. Like we had 2 hurricane warnings here. Like that was insane. We were in Windsor, Essex. Why would that happen here? Or it was really bad air quality. And like the previous speakers mentioned, like there is a clear sign between climate crisis and fossil fuel burning and what we see here today, what we see the increase of bad air quality. Windsor has more asthma rates than other places in Ontario and Canada. That is something notable about us, which is not great to know. I want you to look at the cycle, right? The more we burn fossil fuels, the more likely the ecosystems around us get weaker, the more likely there will be forest fires, the more likely it is that you cannot go outside, you cannot use, say, like active transportation, or you cannot go on your day-to-day. This is worse if you are a racialized person or a disabled person. If you're a disabled person, that means you probably are not be going, or you have asthma, you probably are not going to be able to leave your house on days that have bad air quality, or you're more likely to be in areas with bad air quality if you're near highways or near, other areas, just by urban design. Like talk about Asthma Alley in the Bronx. Talk about the fact that we don't have as much solid information or solid accessible statistics about air quality patterns or what that means to us. And then there's a lot of good work out there, but it needs to be better, it needs to be more accessible, it needs to always be on the top of our minds. If the more we talk about how the climate crisis affects our day-to-day, the more likely it is that we champion it on our day-to-day. What else can I talk about? I have a lot of notes here as people talking, I kept talking. So let's talk about a little bit in Windsor, at least the transportation sector. Right now, more about 25% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from, cars or transportation. Better alternatives to cars. It takes about 30 minutes to get anywhere in Windsor right now. That means you're just sitting in traffic, idling. So let's talk about a little bit about smog or other factors that increase the worsening of the air quality. There's a lot of legal and policy tools, especially in municipal governance, that allow people to, talk about land use or active transportation options that will help us make sure that in the future we'll have less air quality, but bad air quality. But it also, in the meantime, right? If it means I can't take the bus because I'm standing outside waiting for the bus in bad air quality, that means I'm not going to take the bus. Which means if I'm driving the car and everybody else driving the cars, we are making that cycle repeat again and again and again. So we need options for now, because right now, if we don't do this, it'll become much more difficult to depend less on natural gas. But we've discussed a little bit about governance and committees and municipal politics and involvement. Seth talked a little bit about the youth in Vancouver, which I'm glad to be called my friends. But here in Windsor, we see that it's getting harder and harder for everyday citizens to go get involved in municipal politics. Municipal politics or politics in general is a great place to start, but it's been made purposefully difficult for citizens to go and make their statements, especially about talking about active transportation or the environment. We need politicians that we trust, politicians that we know are going to be with us and stand with us. We need to be transparent about what is happening. Our motions in Windsor, we had a motion to declare a climate emergency. It's been largely symbolic. We see a lack of funding for other options like active transport. We see at the recent gas plant, we fought, Jane was there as well, we fought for a renewable alternative. We fought for a battery plant, and yet even after we were told we were going to get what we wanted, they reneged on that. So we need to be able to trust the words of our politicians, and we need to make sure that our voices are heard, because if we keep telling people to show up to these meetings and spend their time and prepare for it, and then nothing will happen, then nothing will happen. You'll lose the people that want to do better. So the question earlier was asked about hope, and yes, there is hope, but there also needs to be action and consequences from those hopes and from those actions. So, community building and making this community better, to rely on each other, to, in moments of climate crisis and health crisis that ensue, have valuable and viable options for people to live. Because right now we see large chunks of population being excluded and unable to go on their day-to-day because of the health crisis and because of the climate crisis. That is unacceptable. And we need to talk about Canada's involvement, not just systematically within Canada, about increased air pollution from natural gas, like building new fossil fuels, but also outside of Canada, and how our actions, what we sell, who do we sell it to, and what we make. I know in Windsor, we're kind of brainwashed by the big three. Like Windsor had a long history of cycling and active transportation that has slowly been depleted away because of the presence of the big three car factories here. So we need to kind of start removing how we are about and centering the economy and focusing on the climate, because the economy will come back, money will come back. It'll be more expensive, actually, if we don't care about what is happening right now. So that is all I have to say. I believe that we can do better, and I believe that Windsor can be better. I have faith that Windsor can move from this legacy of asthma and health crisis and inaccessibility and move on to being a great mid-sized city. But we can't do it alone, and we need to see action from our elected officials, municipally, provincially, and federally. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. I'll post the agenda for next week's one of the committees on council talking about active transportation. I'll post that in the chat after I've introduced our next guest, who is Dr. Jane MacArthur. Jane is the Toxics Program Director with CAPE, which is an acronym for the Canadian Association for Physicians for the Environment. Jane is here to share information about CAPE's advocacy on air pollution, including from their recent reports on the health impacts of traffic-related air pollution. On the weekend, you might find Jane on one of her daily walks in the park with her 2 children and her dog. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Philippa, and thanks to everyone for inviting me, and to the other panelists who I'm so honored to be able to speak among. Your messages are so important and inspirational, as well as despair. So earlier this summer, when the wildfire smoke was thick here in Windsor, Essex, I told my kids they had to wear their N95 respirators outside. They were used to wearing them indoors to prevent the airborne virus SARS-CoV-2, but they were shocked to hear that the air outside was also unsafe to breathe. It was a wake-up call to the increasing existentials that they face, including longstanding concerns about air quality in this region. A few years ago, I completed research with women workers at the Ambassador Bridge about the connections between their high rates of breast cancer and the air pollution from the thousands of diesel trucks crossing the border each day. Bonnie, who worked for over 35 years at the bridge, said, "The environment, I have no control over that other than quitting my job. But the air that we breathe, I don't feel like I have any control over that at all." The point that Bonnie makes is critical to what we're talking about this evening. My kids didn't have control over the air in our neighborhood this past summer, just as Bonnie doesn't have control over the air she breathes at work. From industrial air pollution to pathogens, viruses, and toxins circulating in indoor air, to traffic-related air pollution in our communities, to the increasing wildfire smoke traveling across the landscapes, we as individuals have little control. But governments, municipal, provincial, federal, and globally, can make important interventions to prevent air pollution and the related exposures that lead to ill health and even death. So I'm going to talk more about this link between traffic-related air pollution and ill health. I'm going to summarize for you the findings of the report that Philippa mentioned that we at CAPE released last year. And I'll refer to traffic-related air pollution as TRAP. Just to set the stage, in Canada, 1/3 of people live within 250 meters of a major road and therefore face the potential for elevated exposure to TRAP and the associated health risks. When we think about air pollution, we often think about respiratory or breathing effects. But in our report called Mobilizing Evidence, which was a scoping review of the scientific evidence of the health impacts of TRAP, we revealed a much bigger problem and set of concerns. There are a myriad of illnesses associated with exposure to TRAP that are evident across the life course. Although respiratory and cardiovascular systems are disproportionately targeted by TRAP, other organ systems, including the nervous and reproductive systems, are also impacted. The extensive health outcomes associated with TRAP cumulatively contribute to greater mortality rates across exposed populations. That list of health effects includes many things, from respiratory diseases and infections such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and bronchitis, to cardiovascular diseases and outcomes like hypertension and myocardial infarction, neurological impacts and neurodegenerative diseases, pregnancy-related outcomes, adverse birth outcomes, congenital abnormalities, infertility, eclampsia, cancers, including lung, leukemia, and breast cancer, diabetes, obesity, dermatological outcomes, including eczema, and mental health-related outcomes from the traffic noise exposure, and include anxiety and depression, as well as insomnia and sleep disturbances. We know that children and adolescents are particularly vulnerable to TRAP exposure, with an estimated 5,000 deaths of children per year in Canada. And of course, racialized and poor people often face elevated exposures to TRAP and their related illnesses. So in our report, we made several recommendations for actions that governments could take to prevent TRAP exposure and the ill health related to it. Among the recommendations were adopting pollution prevention and control policies that addressed fuel content and vehicle type requirements, restrictions on idling, low emission zones, and the use of public transit and electric vehicles. Increasing active transport infrastructures such as cycling networks and cycling mode shares. Mandating proper air filtration and ventilation in indoor residential, public, and community gathering spaces. Expanding urban green space and vegetation barriers in high traffic areas, and utilizing individual level actions, including the use of personal protective equipment like respirators, and even increasing dietary antioxidant intake. These recommendations largely recognize that air pollution and related adverse health impacts are a design problem, as Jenna said. To prevent illnesses related to TRAP, we need political will and those with the power to implement, enforce, and extend policies that prevent air pollution, including through additional reforms to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Because individual control over environmental exposures is not always possible. The right to a healthy environment and environmental justice are fundamental to this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. Our next guest is Rhonda Anderson. Now, Rhonda was instrumental in working with community leaders and residents to bring forth settlement agreements with Marathon Refinery that reduced toxic emissions and brought an air monitor to the only public school in Detroit's 48217 community. She boasts more than 30 years of experience as a community and environmental justice organizer and is the recipient of Sierra Club's Virginia Ferguson and Mike McCloskey Awards. Rhonda's varied experience, background, and skills will assist the Sierra Club's executive committee in working in environmental justice and rural communities throughout Michigan. Welcome, Rhonda. Oh, Rhonda, you're muted. Randy, can you help Rhonda, perhaps?
Okay, there we go.
There we go.
All right. First, let me say, you have an amazing panel. Each person that has already spoken has given a wealth of information. So I thank all of you, Jana, Jane, Seth. Seth was amazing in his remarks on fossil fuels. And Jane, we need your information in regards to the health aspects or impacts of a lot of this pollution. So quickly, so here in Detroit, and we started almost 23 years ago, working on the issues of pollution and impact on the surrounding communities. And even then, we knew just from the experience of residents that they were being impacted physically, health-wise, from the pollution around them. Okay, I would go out sometimes in the community knocking on doors, and we were asking people to sign a petition to get some tax relief after Marathon announced their $2.2 billion expansion, bringing in tar sands from Alberta. So what the surprise was, just about every home that we visit, so you're not going to ask someone to sign a petition and not talk to them. You have to have a conversation. So one of the first things that we learned was just about every home that we visited, there had been someone who had died from cancer or someone that was experiencing cancer. So we're just kind of, amazed, and we're confused, And so one of our first efforts was to do a White Cross campaign. The White Cross campaign was a simple campaign. It was to go back to some of those homes, ask the family member if they would place a white cross in their front yard. What we were attempting to do was to give some visualization to the critical issues of health impacts from the pollution. And so since then, we've done so many other things. So another campaign that we put on was around the SO2 emissions from the DTE coal power plant, because it wasn't just a coal power plant in River Rouge, which borders 48217. And it was also the coal power plant in Trenton, and also the coal power plant in St. Clair, I believe it was. So this SO2 that was strongly being emitted, along with, of course, all of the probably hundreds or whatever other toxic emissions coming from these individual industries. So we put on a well-organized campaign that involved hundreds of people coming out to speak at the public hearings with MDEQ, or EGLE as it's now called. And so I like what Jana and Jane were saying in regards to the politics of this, because this is where it sits. It sits at the hands of legislators and state agencies. And when they don't do their promised job of, one, protecting the health and safety of the residents, then we suffer. When you add to that racism, we suffer. Okay, so a lot of what has happened in our communities is simply because we're Black or we're brown, and we happen to live in these areas that are surrounded by polluting industries. Now, it's my opinion, my experience, that there's nothing that's just happenstance about that. I grew up in segregation. We were there because we could not live anywhere else. What else? We also did not have access to the hospitals that were out in the suburbs. So we eventually, because in River Rouge, one doctor stepped up and he built a hospital because we could not go to. So what I'm trying to bring in are all of the different aspects of what is required to have a healthy community, a safe community. Our children are inundated, as Ada was speaking to. And I remember going to a health symposium in Sarnia. I think I was invited by Jim. Okay, so, and I thought that was an amazing health symposium. One of the issues that we're having here in Detroit is lead poisoning. And so when you look and you try to connect the lead to a source, then it's the steel mills, mostly, okay? So our children are suffering even before they go into the kindergarten because of health impacts. Professor Paul Mohai, in his study of looking at the proximity of schools to toxic sites, He's the one that identified 48217, the two bordering cities of River Rouge and Ecorse, as the most polluted in the state of Michigan. Now, if this man had not did his study, even though, remember, you had residents that were telling us something is making us sick, okay? But of course, we don't listen to them because they don't have letters behind their names. They're just, you know, regular people, and we don't give them the credit for their expertise, okay? But if Paul Mohai had not done that study, we would have no knowledge to this moment of how badly some of these communities are being polluted. So I think one of the things that we need to, or could, something that would be helpful, is to work together. And that's another thing that Jim has done over these years, Jim and Margaret and Ada. We have tried to work together to make some of these changes happen. But again, when you look at the politics of things, when corporations and industries have billions of dollars to influence legislators, you know, it ain't gonna happen. Real quick, I went to New Orleans 2 times this year, maybe last year and this year. And we did a tour, Cancer Alley tour. It was one of the most devastating experience of my life. And I've been in this business now for over 23 years. It actually hurt my heart, my feelings. This gentleman got up in front of us and he said, and I bet you've heard this before, he said, they are killing us. They are murdering our children. I'll be damned. If you can't get up and do something after that, then I don't know what. But do you know, no one did a thing. No one. The health agency in New Orleans didn't do anything, but they did get a little bit of pressure and said that they were going to go back and look at some of the industries that are impacting this communities. So I think I'm almost at my end, am I? I didn't hear that harp.
I think you managed your time well, Rhonda, and thank you so much.
Great.
I noticed in the chat that Jane has posted a comment to that, and she says that your point is critical to this particular discussion on air quality. And in Canada, there is actually a bill to redress environmental racism, and it's winding its way through Parliament. So she's posted a link to that bill. Let me move on to our next guest, Derek Coronado, who has been an environmental activist for more than 25 years. Since 2008, he's been the executive director of the Citizens Environment Alliance here in Windsor. He holds political science degrees from the University of Windsor and Dalhousie University. Welcome, Derek.
Thank you for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. I've got a few slides. I've got an old computer, so bear with me for a few seconds. Sometimes I have to use a hand crank on it in the morning, so let's see how this works. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Great. And thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm going to talk about urban climate action accountability, and this is focused on municipal governments, obviously. So let's get started. So in Canada and Ontario, around 80% live in cities, and municipal jurisdictions are responsible for about half of emissions. So cities are very important when it comes to climate action. And climate accountability really is a means of addressing the climate needs and challenges of municipalities. The Citizens Environment Alliance co-published the Accountability Framework Handbook in collaboration with other members of the Urban Climate Alliance, which is an alliance of municipal-based organizations that work on climate action in Southern Ontario. And this framework handbook was produced to help cities navigate the ongoing challenge of advancing climate action. And obviously that's a big challenge for cities. We looked at, or we included 7 themes in the framework handbook. I'm not going to go through all of them, but these are just outlines. Science-based emissions targets, policies and actions strategy, governance, social equity, which includes environmental justice, funding, data, communications, and community engagement. So let me just talk about a few of them. I'm just going to go through them quickly. Science-based emissions targets and what is reasonable. We often hear this when we go to councils and we talk to councilors, and we talk to administration, the term reasonable in terms of taking action. And every good climate plan starts with a reasonable climate emissions target. And what is reasonable? Well, reasonable are targets that are commensurate with IPCC commitments. These are commitments made in Canada by the national government, the federal government. Cities must fully work to decarbonize by mid-century or sooner, according to the science. So we're not just talking about net zero, we're talking about decarbonizing. Net zero is balancing emissions. Our targets, and each of these sections, I should mention, also include questions that can be asked within the municipality. So these are questions to help people in the municipalities focus on these issues. So in this section, this is an example of one of those questions. Are targets ambitious? That is, are they in line with IPCC targets and aiming for complete decarbonization by mid-century? If they aren't, well, then you don't have reasonable targets. Another section, data monitoring and reporting. So there's an old saying in the monitoring field, and that is what gets measured gets done. You have to be monitoring and you have to collect data. When it comes to reporting, frequency matters as well. Regular data collection, thorough monitoring, routine reporting, and iterative improvements on long-term plan are all critical for municipalities. One of the questions from this section, is there a robust and transparent monitoring and reporting process for the climate actions set out in the plan? Another section, climate governance and public accountability, effective governance and public input and understanding. These are the issues of the intersection of the public with their municipal government. So effective climate governance must include opportunities for public input and feedback. What does that look like? Well, clear and transparent reporting systems and establishing participatory structures for civil society. Those often take the form of things such as workshops or public open houses. But the standards have to be pretty high in terms of providing public participation. And here's one of the questions from that section. Has your city taken proactive measures to ensure climate governance is inclusive and accountable to the public? So the handbook is available on our website and you can find it there. I just want to mention, obviously, municipalities don't operate in a vacuum. They are, to a great extent, creatures of higher levels of government. In the province of Ontario, right now, it's making it extremely difficult. The provincial government is making it extremely difficult for municipalities to maneuver around the climate challenges. I'm not going to talk about things like omnibus bills like Bill 23, but let's just focus for a second on, oh, I guess my 5 minutes are up. I'll just mention that what's happening in Ontario right now is we're going backwards. We're increasing the pollution that's available in the atmosphere, and that's going to cause a lot of problems for municipalities. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Your presentation gives a whole bunch of ideas to me for the upcoming consultation on the sustainability of Sandwich South. So I think you and I need to talk about that at some point. But in the meanwhile, our final guest of the evening is Dr. Michael Gilbertson. Now, Michael has worked for decades to identify the effects of toxic substances in the Great Lakes Basin. He's worked for the International Joint Commission on the Great Lakes, the IJC, and co-authored a study on the health of Windsor. Michael has a doctorate from Stirling University in Scotland. Welcome, Michael.
I want to put some slides up if I could. I see that Derek's slides are still there. Can somebody take Derek's down?
Michael, I think if you just hit share screen at the bottom, you'll end up taking over, I think.
Okay. I think I'm getting there. I don't seem to be able to take his down.
Derek, are you able to stop screen sharing from your end?
Ah, very good. Right. Very good. Thank you for asking me to come and give a talk tonight. Jim Brophy asked me to be involved in a worker compensation appeal case before the Ontario Workplace Safety and Insurance Appeals Tribunal that lasted between 2010 and 2018. The appeal was for a female border guard who worked 20 years at the Ambassador Bridge with Canada Border Services Agency. And her first bout of estrogen receptor negative breast cancer was in 1999, and her second was in 2004. And she was part of a cluster of 6 to 8 female premenopausal breast cancer cases among 130 premenopausal female staff. This was between December 1999 and June 2002. This represents an age-adjusted relative risk of at least a 47-fold rate compared to Essex County. There was a replica cluster of between 6 to 8 cases at the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel at about the same time. The specific putative occupational risk factors alleged to be causing her breast cancers were traffic-related air pollution, night shift work, and cigarette smoke in the office. The Canada Border Services Agency countered with her not having had a child, her upbringing on a farm, use of hair dye, and occasional use of oral contraceptives, and, quote, a family history alleging a genetic predisposition to breast cancer gene BRCA1 dysfunction. The tribunal decided the case using a biased principle that if the epidemiology does not disclose an association in the first place, then there is no need to address causation. The tribunal erroneously dismissed the case using the epidemiological lack of correlation between estrogen receptor negative status breast cancer with the various putative risk factors. Nitrogen dioxide has been used as an indicator of traffic-related air pollution and shown to be correlated with breast cancer risk. The levels of NO2 at the bridge are routinely between 100 and 200 parts per billion, compared to downtown Windsor with levels between 20 and 30 parts per billion. Nitrogen dioxide levels at the Ambassador Bridge and at the tunnel are equivalent to a 5 to 10-fold increased risk for breast cancer. There are coherent sources of traffic-related air pollution, with 12,000 trucks per day crossing the Ambassador Bridge, representing the busiest North American truck crossing. Exposures of rats to dimethylbenzanthracene, which is an experimental mammary carcinogen, indicates that it would take about 15 years to develop mammary cancer in humans. However, this latency is reduced by 36%, and the number of mammary tumors is increased by 60%, with altered photoperiod as light at night, similar to night shift work. There is a high probability of tumor suppressor dysfunction, analogous to a hereditary genetic family history of breast cancer, that can be best explained by the dioxins in traffic-related air pollution, which are epigenetically silencing gene transcription of the breast cancer BRCA1 gene. The claimant is an index case of a novel disease that Jim Brophy and I are calling occupational BRCA-ness. And she is still alive, indicating that retirement and removal from the work site enables restoration of the BRCA1 gene function by depuration of the dioxins. The estrogen receptor negative status used by the tribunal to dismiss the case is not a single statistical entity, but represents many subtypes of breast cancer, which, when statistically aggregated, tend toward the null. There are, however, many ways of becoming estrogen receptor negative, including exposure to dioxin, representing different diseases and different processes, and thus estrogen receptor negative status is a meaningless aggregate for correlation analysis. When Mike Harris became Premier of Ontario in 1995, one of his first acts was to fire Ron Ellis, who was head of the former Worker Compensation Appeals Tribunal, indicating politicization of the formerly arm's-length organization. I conclude that the case demonstrates not only the Ambassador Bridge and Detroit-Windsor Tunnel are some of the most dangerous workplaces, but also the case represents criminal dereliction of duty, not only by the CBSA senior management and the union representing the border guards, but also by the federal and Ontario provincial governments over more than 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And you were right on time. And we were wondering about questions, but I see it's 7:58. So this has been a wonderful, broad variety of presentations on this subject. And I'm going to hand the mic over to Doug Hayes for the close.
Good evening. I would just like to thank our guests for your participation and your input. It is very valuable to our discussion and awareness of what we are up against. But I would also like to I would just like to talk about what I heat my house with geothermal energy. I have a heat pump, and Karen McKenzie might want to talk to me later about that. I don't use very little natural gas just to heat my hot water, a backup for my hot water solar system. But anyway, thank you very much, the presenters, for being with us tonight, and good evening. Have a good day. Have a good evening.